Imagine a woman holding Egypt's destiny in her hands, a queen bold enough to stare down the mightiest empire the world had ever seen. But who was she really? A divine ruler, a brilliant strategist, a captivating enchantress, or perhaps a reckless gambler? The story of Cleopatra is so much more than a legend. It's a rich, complicated saga of ambition, love, and ultimately, a heartbreaking downfall. So, let's forget the myths for a moment, because the reality of Egypt's last pharaoh, it's far more captivating. Born in 69 BCE, Cleopatra's seventh Philopator entered a world already wobbling on the edge. She was a descendant of Ptolemy I Soter, one of Alexander the Great's Macedonian Greek generals, who kicked off the Ptolemaic dynasty in Egypt. Now this dynasty, while ruling Egypt for nearly 3 centuries, was Greek to its core, not ethnically Egyptian. They governed from Alexandria, a stunning multicultural hub of Greek civilization, often keeping a distance from the native Egyptian people. In fact, most Ptolemaic rulers never even bothered to learn the Egyptian language. But Cleopatra? She was different. Incredibly smart and well-educated, she had a top-notch Hellenistic Greek education, learning the arts of public speaking and philosophy from tutors like Philostratos. Word is, she was fluent in as many as 9 languages, including her native Koine Greek, Egyptian, Ethiopian, Hebrew, and even Latin. This knack for languages was a big deal, setting her apart from her predecessors and letting her connect with all sorts of people in her kingdom and beyond. Her father, Ptolemy XII Auletes, was a bit of a character, known more for his flute-playing and lavish lifestyle than for strong leadership. His reign saw Egypt becoming more and more dependent on Rome, a republic that was rapidly spreading its influence across the Mediterranean. This reliance didn't come cheap, either financially or politically. Egypt, despite being incredibly rich from farming and trade, was drowning in debt to Rome and was riddled with internal problems. The Ptolemaic dynasty itself was infamous for its vicious family feuds, siblings marrying each other to hold on to power, constant plots, and assassinations. This was the dangerous world Cleopatra was born into, a place where just surviving, let alone ruling, took extraordinary cunning and a ruthless streak. Her early years in the Alexandrian palace showed her just how shaky power could be. Ptolemy XII, seeing which way the wind was blowing with Rome, actually named Rome as an executor of his will. This will stated that Cleopatra should marry her younger brother, Ptolemy XIII, and rule alongside him. This kind of setup was pretty common in the Ptolemaic dynasty. It was meant to keep the family in charge, but it often just planted the seeds for future fights. When Ptolemy XII died in 51 BCE, Cleopatra, only about 18 at the time, found herself on a throne that was anything but stable. She inherited a kingdom loaded with resources but crippled by debt, a court full of schemes, and a powerful neighbor Rome, whose shadow just kept growing larger. Cleopatra's joint rule with her younger brother, Ptolemy XIII, was, as you might expect, a rocky road from day one. Ancient Egyptian tradition and Ptolemaic custom might have called for these co-regencies, often sealed with a sibling marriage, but they were rarely true partnerships. Cleopatra, sharp, ambitious, and already showing a knack for politics, wasn't about to be a silent partner. Ptolemy XIII, though younger, had his own crew of influential courtiers and advisors, guys like the eunuch Pothinus, General Achilles, and his tutor Theodotus of Chios, who saw Cleopatra's strong will as a direct threat to their own power over the young king. The power struggle blew up pretty quickly. At first, documents were signed with Cleopatra's name first, but by 50 BCE, Ptolemy XIII and his buddies started pushing his name to the top. This wasn't just about appearances, it was a clear signal that the power balance in the palace was shifting. The court was splitting, and Cleopatra found herself more and more alone. Things really came to a head around 49 or 48 BCE, heavily swayed by his advisors who probably figured they could control a younger, more easily influenced monarch. Ptolemy XIII and his supporters managed to kick Cleopatra out of Alexandria. She was forced into exile, fleeing to Syria. This was a massive turning point. For many, exile would have been the end of the line. But for Cleopatra, it was like a dare, a challenge that would force her to use every bit of her intelligence, charisma, and unshakable determination to get her throne back. Even in exile, Cleopatra didn't just sit around. She started putting together a mercenary army, showing just how resourceful she was, and that she absolutely refused to give up. She knew that just waltzing back into Egypt wasn't going to cut it. She needed a powerful ally, someone from the outside who could tip the scales in her favor. The complicated political scene in the Mediterranean, dominated by Rome's own internal power struggles, would soon give her an unexpected but game-changing opportunity. The stage was being set for one of history's most dramatic comebacks. While Cleopatra was plotting her return from exile, the Roman Republic was tearing itself apart in a civil war. The fight between Julius Caesar, a brilliant general and hungry politician, and Pompey the Great, another of Rome's top dogs, was nearing its explosive end. After a crushing defeat at the Battle of Pharsalus in 48 BCE, Pompey ran, hoping to find safety in Egypt. But Ptolemy XIII's court, led by Pothinus and Achillas, saw a chance. In a spectacularly bad move, they had Pompey assassinated right as he stepped ashore, thinking it would win them points with the victorious Caesar. When Caesar arrived in Alexandria hunting for his rival, he was handed Pompey's severed head. Instead of being pleased, Caesar was reportedly horrified by the murder of a Roman consul and former ally. Caesar's arrival in Alexandria was the moment Cleopatra had been waiting for. Egypt was technically under Roman protection, and Caesar, as the top Roman in charge, felt he had to step in and sort out the mess between Cleopatra and her brother, just like their father's will, which named Rome as executor, had said. The big challenge for Cleopatra, getting to Caesar, he was holed up in the royal palace, which was basically enemy headquarters for her. What she did next? Pure genius and guts. According to the historian Plutarch, Cleopatra had herself smuggled into the palace. The famous story is that she was hidden inside a carpet or a bed sack, which was then carried right into Caesar's private rooms. This incredibly daring move got her a private audience with the most powerful man in Rome. It was a huge risk, showing off her courage and her smarts. She knew a direct personal appeal could be way more effective than playing by the usual diplomatic rules, especially given how shaky her position was. The meeting between the 52-year-old Caesar and the 21-year-old Cleopatra would literally change history. It wasn't just her famous charm, though that probably didn't hurt. Cleopatra was also intelligent, well-spoken, and politically sharp. She laid out her case, arguing her rightful claim to the throne. Caesar, no fool himself in politics, saw the benefits of an alliance. Cleopatra was a capable and ambitious ruler who, with Roman support, could bring stability to Egypt, a kingdom Rome desperately needed for its grain supplies and strategic position. Caesar declared that Cleopatra and Ptolemy XIII should rule together, just as their father's will had wanted. But this didn't go down well with Ptolemy XIII's faction. They didn't trust Cleopatra's influence over Caesar and launched an open revolt, which led to the siege of Alexandria. Caesar, with only a small force, found himself trapped in the royal palace with Cleopatra. Months of brutal fighting followed, during which parts of the legendary Library of Alexandria might have been damaged. Cleopatra's younger sister, Arsinoe IV, also escaped and started her own rebellion, making things even more complicated. Roman reinforcements finally showed up, and in early 47 BCE, Caesar's army crushed Ptolemy XIII's forces at the Battle of the Nile. Ptolemy XIII drowned in the river trying to escape. With her main rivals out of the picture, Caesar put Cleopatra back on the throne. To keep up appearances with Ptolemaic tradition, she was made co-ruler with her even younger brother, Ptolemy XIV, whom she also married. But make no mistake, everyone knew who was really calling the shots. Their alliance was both political and personal. Cleopatra had a son with Caesar, Ptolemy XIV Caesar, famously known as Caesarion or Little Caesar. This child was a powerful symbol, a potential heir to both Egyptian and Roman legacies, though Caesar never officially recognized him as such under Roman law. Around 46 BCE, Cleopatra, along with Ptolemy XIV and young Caesarion, visited Rome. They stayed in Caesar's villa, and Caesar granted both Cleopatra and Ptolemy XIV the official status of friend and ally of the Roman people. This visit definitely caused a stir in Rome, showing off Caesar's exotic queen to a society pretty wary of foreign influence. Cleopatra stayed in Rome until Caesar was assassinated on the Ides of March in 44 BCE. His death plunged the Roman world back into chaos and kicked off a dangerous new chapter for Cleopatra. Her main protector was gone, and she had to navigate a landscape now swarming with ambitious Roman warlords fighting for control. She quickly returned to Egypt. Soon after, her co-ruler and brother Ptolemy XIV died, some say poisoned on her orders, allowing her to make her 3-year-old son Caesarion her co-ruler. Unlike her teenage brother, her toddler son wasn't an immediate threat to her sole authority, and his parentage only strengthened her legitimacy. Cleopatra had weathered her first major storm, securing her throne with Roman help and her own brilliant strategy. But her reliance on Rome was a double-edged sword, and new Roman power players were starting to emerge. Julius Caesar's assassination threw Rome into another savage round of civil wars. The key figures to claw their way out of the chaos were Caesar's adopted son and heir Octavian, and Caesar's loyal, larger-than-life general, Mark Antony. Together with Marcus Aemilius Lepidus, they formed the Second Triumvirate, basically splitting the Roman world among themselves. Antony got the eastern provinces, which naturally pulled him into Cleopatra's orbit. In 41 BCE, Antony summoned Cleopatra to Tarsus, in what's now Turkey. Officially, he was looking into her loyalty, or maybe her lack of enthusiastic support for the triumvirate during their recent war against Caesar's assassins. But he also needed resources, specifically Egypt's immense wealth, to bankroll his planned military campaigns, especially against the Parthian Empire. Cleopatra, always a master of image and strategic entrances, didn't show up like someone in trouble. Instead, she made an entrance for the ages. She sailed up the Cydnus River on a golden barge with purple sails and silver oars. Herself dressed as the goddess Venus, or the Greek Aphrodite, who was often linked with the Egyptian goddess Isis, surrounded by attendants dressed as cupids and nereids. The whole spectacle was designed to wow everyone, to show off her wealth, power, and divine status, and to meet Antony, who often liked to compare himself to the god Dionysus, on equal footing. Antony, known for his love of grandeur and charisma, was completely captivated. What started as a political meeting quickly blossomed into one of history's most legendary love affairs. But right from the start, it was also a powerful political alliance. Cleopatra saw Antony as a new Roman protector, a charismatic and strong military leader who could help her keep Egypt independent and maybe even expand its influence. Antony, in turn, got access to Egypt's riches, its grain, gold, and shipbuilding capacity, all vital for his military goals and his political standing in Rome. They spent the winter of 40 BCE together in Alexandria, a time filled with lavish parties and strategic plotting. Cleopatra's intelligence, wit, and political savvy clearly impressed Antony just as much as her charm did. This wasn't just some Roman general being seduced by an exotic queen, it was a meeting of two ambitious, powerful people who saw how much they could gain by teaming up. In 40 BCE, Cleopatra gave birth to twins by Antony, Alexander Helios, the sun, and Cleopatra Selene II, the moon. Several years later in 36 BCE, they'd have another son, Ptolemy Philadelphus. Their relationship, though, wasn't without its hitches. Antony was already married to Fulvia, who was actively fighting Octavian in Italy. After Fulvia died, Antony, for political reasons, married Octavian's sister, Octavia, in 40 BCE to try and patch things up between the triumvirs. For a few years, Antony focused on Roman matters and his Parthian campaigns, spending time away from Cleopatra. But the pull of Egypt and its queen, and the strategic importance of their partnership, eventually drew him back. By 37 BCE, Antony had returned to Cleopatra, and their relationship was back on, more public and defiant than ever. He started giving Roman territories in the east to Cleopatra and her children, an act that became known as the Donations of Alexandria in 34 BCE. He declared Caesarion to be Caesar's true son and legal heir, a direct slap in the face to Octavian, whose whole claim to power rested on being adopted by Caesar. Antony also named Cleopatra Queen of Kings and her children as rulers of various territories. These moves were bold political statements, but they played right into Octavian's hands back in Rome. Octavian, a propaganda genius, pounced on Antony's relationship with Cleopatra and the Donations of Alexandria. He painted Antony as a man bewitched by a foreign sorceress, a traitor who was giving away Roman lands and turning his back on Roman values for an Eastern queen. He portrayed Cleopatra as a dangerous, ambitious woman aiming to control Rome. This smear campaign was incredibly effective in turning Roman public opinion, and even many of Antony's own supporters, against him. The deep personal and political rivalry between Octavian and Antony, made even worse by Antony's public devotion to Cleopatra, was pushing them steadily towards a final winner-takes-all showdown. Cleopatra, by tying her fate so tightly to Antony's, had made an incredibly risky bet. The future of her dynasty and Egypt's independence was now hanging by a thread. And believe me, this incredible story is nowhere near finished. If you love getting caught up in the power struggles and epic tales of the ancient world, hit that subscribe button and ring the bell. You won't want to miss what we explore next. Oh, and if Cleopatra's story is grabbing you, show us some love with a thumbs up. Back in Rome, things were about to explode. Octavian, having expertly swayed public opinion and tightened his grip on power in the West, saw his chance. Antony's behavior, his very public affair with Cleopatra, his divorce from Octavia, Octavian's own sister, in 32 BCE, and those bold donations of Alexandria, handed Octavian all the ammo he needed. He painted Antony as a man who'd gone native, a Roman general completely under the spell of a foreign queen, essentially betraying everything Rome stood for. Octavian then illegally got his hands on Antony's will from the Temple of Vesta in Rome and read it out loud to the Senate. The will supposedly confirmed the land gifts to Cleopatra and her kids, and stated Antony's wish to be buried in Alexandria next to Cleopatra. This was the ultimate insult, proof, they said, that Antony no longer considered himself Roman. The Senate, heavily influenced by Octavian, stripped Antony of his consular powers and, in a masterstroke, declared war, not on Antony because that would have risked yet another Roman civil war, but on Cleopatra. This was a very clever political move by Octavian. It framed the whole conflict as Rome defending itself against a dangerous foreign enemy, with Antony merely her brainwashed sidekick. Antony and Cleopatra rallied their forces. Together they were a formidable power, with a massive fleet and battle-hardened legions. Egypt's wealth fueled their war effort. They set up their headquarters in Greece, bracing for the inevitable clash with Octavian. Cleopatra herself was there with Antony's forces, a decision that, while showing her commitment, also added fuel to Octavian's propaganda fire that Antony was her puppet. The decisive showdown happened on September 2, 31 BCE, at the naval Battle of Actium, off Greece's western coast. The battle's details are complicated and often debated by historians, largely because the story we have is the one told by the winner, Octavian. Octavian's fleet, under the command of the brilliant admiral Marcus Vipsanius Agrippa, was generally made up of lighter, quicker ships compared to Antony and Cleopatra's larger, heavier warships. During the heat of the battle, for reasons that are still argued about, Cleopatra's squadron of 60 ships was seen raising sail and breaking away from the fight, heading south towards Egypt. Antony, seeing her leave, followed her with a number of his own ships, essentially abandoning the main part of his fleet and army. Some old sources say Cleopatra fled out of fear, or maybe they had a pre-arranged escape plan if things went sour. Others suggest her withdrawal might have been a tactical move, perhaps to lure some of Octavian's fleet away or to save a part of their forces. But Antony's decision to follow her? That was a disaster for the morale and organization of his remaining troops. Whatever the exact reasons, the result was catastrophic. The leaderless rest of Antony's fleet was utterly crushed by Agrippa. Many of Antony's land forces stationed nearby saw the naval disaster and their commanders sailing away, and eventually they surrendered to Octavian. The Battle of Actium was the point of no return. It demolished Antony's military power and his political standing. For Cleopatra, it marked the beginning of the end for her rule and for Egypt's independence. Their joint strategy, built on mutual support and Egyptian resources, had failed spectacularly on the world stage. The way was now clear for Octavian to become the undisputed master of the Roman world and to set his sights on the final conquest of Egypt. Antony and Cleopatra made it back to Alexandria, their alliance still technically intact, but their dreams of an Eastern Empire, or even just survival, were fading fast. The noose was tightening. The year after the Actium disaster? It was pure desperation for Antony and Cleopatra. They limped back to Alexandria, their vibrant capital now living under a shadow of impending doom. News of their defeat spread like wildfire, and Antony's remaining allies and client kings started jumping ship to Octavian's side. Their attempts to regroup and scrape together new armies were pretty much useless. All the momentum was with Octavian. Cleopatra, always a realist even when things looked hopeless, reportedly tried several times to negotiate with Octavian. It's said she offered him huge amounts of money and priceless gifts, hoping to save her kingdom for her children, maybe even offering to send Antony into exile as a bargaining chip. But Octavian wasn't budging. He wanted total victory, the annexation of Egypt with all its incredible wealth, and to get rid of any potential rivals. Caesarion, Cleopatra's son by Julius Caesar, was a particular threat to Octavian's claim as Caesar's one true heir. Antony, meanwhile, sank into a deep depression, broken up by bouts of wild partying, as he watched his world crumble around him. He saw his legions deserting him, his power just vanishing into thin air. Octavian's forces systematically advanced, securing the eastern Mediterranean and gearing up for the final invasion of Egypt. In the summer of 30 BCE, Octavian's legions reached the outskirts of Alexandria. Antony gathered what forces he had left for one last stand, but they were no match for Octavian's seasoned troops. After a short final defeat, and hearing a false rumor that Cleopatra had already killed herself, Antony decided to end his own life. He asked his attendant Eros to kill him, but Eros killed himself instead. Antony then fell on his own sword, but the wound didn't kill him instantly. Mortally wounded, he was carried to the mausoleum, where Cleopatra had locked herself in with her closest attendants and her treasures. Ancient accounts paint a heartbreaking picture of their final meeting. Antony died in Cleopatra's arms, bringing a tragic close to their legendary and stormy love affair and political partnership. His death left Cleopatra completely alone to face the triumphant Octavian. Cleopatra knew her fate was sealed. Octavian entered Alexandria, now its unquestioned ruler. While Roman sources, keen to make Octavian look good, suggest he wanted to capture Cleopatra alive to parade her in his triumph in Rome. Cleopatra had other ideas. Being dragged through the streets of Rome as a captive was an indignity she was determined to avoid. Her final days were spent in captivity, though probably still within her palace or mausoleum. She got Octavian's permission to perform Antony's funeral rites. After this, knowing the humiliation that was coming and likely terrified for her children's fate, she decided to end her own life. The story of the aspi, a venomous snake, smuggled to her in a basket of figs, being the most famous. Whether it was an asp, some other poison, or even a sharp object, she achieved her goal. Cleopatra VII, the last pharaoh of Egypt, died on August 10th or 12th, 30 BCE. Octavian, finding out she was dead, was reportedly frustrated that he'd been denied his ultimate prize for his triumph. Caesarion, the Little Caesar, who was a clear dynastic threat, was hunted down and executed on Octavian's orders. Cleopatra's children by Antony were taken to Rome, paraded in Octavian's triumph, and then raised by Octavia. Cleopatra Selene II would later marry Juba II of Numidia and Mauritania, and through her, Cleopatra's bloodline would actually continue. Cleopatra's death at just 39 wasn't just the end of her story, it was the end of an entire age. With her passing in 30 BCE, the Ptolemaic dynasty, which had ruled Egypt for nearly 300 years, came to a sudden and final stop. Egypt was officially swallowed up as a province of the Roman Empire. Octavian, soon to be Emperor Augustus, treated Egypt almost like his personal piggy bank. Roman administrators took over, and while some Ptolemaic systems were kept for a while, Roman control was absolute. Egypt's traditional religious and cultural practices began a slow fade under Roman influence and later, the rise of Christianity. Right after her death, Roman propaganda painted her as a decadent, manipulative, power-hungry foreign seductress. Yet, over the centuries, this flat, one-sided picture has been challenged and re-examined. Modern historians increasingly highlight her intelligence, political savvy, strategic brilliance, and sheer toughness. Cleopatra has become this timeless symbol of female power, a figure who smashed the sexist norms of her time to rule an empire. Her life has sparked countless plays, poems, operas, paintings, and movies, with each generation retelling her story. Today we see her as a complex, multi-layered figure, a brilliant strategist, a charismatic leader, a devoted mother. But Cleopatra, the last pharaoh of Egypt, continues to fascinate and captivate us, her name forever etched in history. What part of Cleopatra's story do you find most captivating? Share your thoughts in the comments below. We genuinely love to hear what you think. So, Cleopatra's time as queen? Think of it as this incredible high-stakes tightrope walk over a raging fire, a constant battle to keep Egypt free as Rome grew stronger and stronger. She used her brains, her charm, and her kingdom's wealth with amazing skill, forging alliances with the most powerful men of her day. Her relationships with Julius Caesar and Mark Antony weren't just casual flings, they were calculated risks, massive gambles for her throne and Egypt's future. For over 20 years she navigated treacherous political waters, outsmarted rivals, and presented herself as a living goddess, the reincarnation of Isis to her people. She fought tooth and nail to protect a Hellenistic world that Rome was relentlessly swallowing whole. In the end, the power stacked against her, especially Octavian's cold, calculated ambition, was just too much. The defeat at Actium and the subsequent loss of Egypt, that was a massive turning point in history, the last lights of pharaonic rule flickering out, and the Roman Empire stepping firmly and permanently into the spotlight. But Cleopatra's story didn't die with her and the fall of her empire. It transformed into a legend that has gripped the world for over 2,000 years. Once you peel back the layers of Roman spin, you see this incredible leader, intelligent, multilingual, and fiercely protective of her kingdom and her children. Her life is a powerful, tragic story of a queen who dared to challenge an empire, leaving a mark on history and our imaginations that's impossible to ignore. Egypt's last pharaoh didn't just fall, she shone with a dazzling, defiant light right until the very end. He built an empire with blood. He transformed a nation through terror. He was worshipped as a god, but ruled like a devil. His name was Joseph Stalin. And what if the story you think you know barely scratches the surface of the absolute brutality, the chilling paranoia, and the sheer audacity of the man who arguably shaped the 20th century more profoundly than any other, all while committing crimes on an unimaginable scale? From an impoverished seminary student to the undisputed dictator of the Soviet Union, how did this happen? And what was the true cost of his reign? Get ready to confront the chilling rise and the ultimate bloody fall of the 20th century's most enigmatic tyrant. Our story begins not in the Kremlin but in a small, impoverished town in Georgia, 1878. Born Iosif Vissarionovich Jugashvili, the son of a shoemaker and a washerwoman, his early life was marked by poverty, an abusive father, and a deeply religious mother who pushed him towards the priesthood. He even attended a seminary. But young Iosif found a different gospel, Marxism. He was drawn to the radical underground, embracing the ideas of revolution and change. He adopted the pseudonym Stalin, the Man of Steel, a name that would soon define an era of iron rule. Before the 1917 revolution, he was known as a ruthless operative, a bank robber, an enforcer for the Bolsheviks, Lenin's wonderful Georgian. His methods were brutal, his loyalty unquestioning. He was a man willing to do the dirty work. When the Russian Revolution erupted in 1917, throwing centuries of czarist rule into chaos, Stalin was not on the front lines of intellectual debate or grand strategy. While figures like Lenin and Trotsky dazzled with rhetoric, Stalin quietly mastered the mechanics of power. He wasn't the ideologue, he was the administrator, the organizer, the man who controlled the party machine. This seemingly unassuming role would prove to be his most potent weapon. After the revolution, as the Bolsheviks consolidated power, Lenin recognized Stalin's organizational skills, appointing him General Secretary of the Communist Party in 1922. On the surface, this seemed like a dull, bureaucratic role. But Stalin saw its true potential. He controlled appointments, promotions, and expulsions. He built a vast network of loyalists. When Lenin suffered a debilitating stroke, a power vacuum emerged. The intellectual giants like Trotsky believed their charisma and ideological purity would secure their succession. But they underestimated the Man of Steel. Stalin, methodically, relentlessly, began to isolate and undermine his rivals. He was a master of political maneuvering, intrigue, and ruthless opportunism. He played them against each other, smeared their reputations, and gradually stripped them of their influence. Trotsky, once Lenin's presumed successor, was exiled, then ruthlessly hunted down and assassinated in Mexico. Others were systematically purged, accused of treason, and eliminated. By the late 1920s, the quiet bureaucrat had outmaneuvered every single one of them. The stage was set for absolute power. By 1929, Stalin was the undisputed dictator of the Soviet Union. His vision was clear: rapidly industrialize the agrarian nation and transform it into a global power. But his methods were horrifyingly brutal. His policy of forced collectivization seized private land, leading to widespread resistance and engineered famines, most notably the Holodomor in Ukraine, which deliberately starved millions to death. This wasn't a side effect, it was a weapon. But perhaps his most terrifying legacy was the Great Purge of the 1930s. Driven by a pathological paranoia, Stalin systematically eliminated anyone perceived as a threat: old Bolsheviks, military leaders, intellectuals, even ordinary citizens. Show trials, forced confessions extracted through torture, and mass executions became routine. Millions were sent to the brutal, forced labor camps of the Gulag, where they perished from starvation, exhaustion, and unimaginable cruelty. It's estimated that tens of millions suffered under his iron fist. His terror knew no bounds. This wasn't just political suppression, it was a systematic dismantling of society, fueled by fear and the cult of personality. Stalin demanded absolute loyalty, and even the slightest hint of dissent meant certain death. In 1941, the nightmare of World War II arrived on Soviet soil with the Nazi invasion. Despite initial catastrophic losses, the Soviet Union, under Stalin's brutal, unyielding leadership, eventually turned the tide. The cost was astronomical. Over 20 million Soviet citizens died, a sacrifice that in many ways secured Allied victory. Stalin, now hailed as a war hero, emerged from the conflict not weakened but emboldened. His power was cemented. The post-war era saw the rapid expansion of Soviet influence into Eastern Europe, creating an Iron Curtain and igniting the Cold War with the West. Despite the victory, the internal repression continued. Anyone suspected of disloyalty, even returning POWs, faced the Gulag. His paranoia only intensified. By the early 1950s, Stalin's health was failing, but his grip on power remained absolute. His paranoia, however, reached new heights. He launched new purges, targeting doctors, Jews, and his closest associates. The terror continued. On March 5, 1953, Joseph Stalin died. The official cause was a cerebral hemorrhage, but lingering questions about foul play persist. The reaction was monumental, public outpouring of grief mixed with unspoken relief and terror. For the Soviet people, it was the end of an era. For the world, it was the end of an absolute chilling reign. Stalin's death did not immediately erase his legacy. His successors, notably Nikita Khrushchev, eventually initiated a process of de-Stalinization, condemning his excesses and dismantling the cult of personality. But the scars ran deep. The regime he built, founded on terror and absolute control, eventually crumbled under its own weight decades later. The millions dead, the shattered lives, the suppressed freedoms, these are the true monuments to Joseph Stalin. His story is a chilling reminder of how a seemingly unassuming man can rise to absolute power, how power can corrupt absolutely, and the horrific cost when a nation trades freedom for the promise of order. The fall of Stalin's body did not erase the shadow he cast, a shadow that still lingers over parts of the world today. Understanding his rise and the brutal mechanics of his power is not just about historical record, it's a vital lesson for humanity. If this journey through one of history's darkest chapters brought you new understanding, please give this video a like and consider subscribing to History Distilled for more stories that reveal the true forces shaping our world.
Imagine a world of unparalleled globalism. Mighty empires stretched across continents, their ships crossing vast seas laden with exotic goods. Bronze shimmered, cities thrived, and diplomatic letters bound rulers in a complex web of alliances and trade. This was the Late Bronze Age, a golden era stretching from around 1600 to 1200 BCE, a true superpower age. At its zenith, this world was a marvel of interconnectedness. In Egypt, pharaohs ruled a colossal empire, their wealth flowing from the Nile. To the north, the mighty Hittites commanded Anatolia, their chariots feared across the ancient world. In Greece, the Mycenaeans built citadels of stone and controlled the Aegean trade. Diplomacy was key. Kings addressed each other as brother in diplomatic correspondence, exchanged lavish gifts, and shared technologies. Trade routes were vital arteries, funneling precious copper, tin, gold, timber, and exotic goods across the entire region. This wasn't just trade. It was a global supply chain, forging dependency and incredible prosperity. For centuries, this system held. But the very threads that bound this golden age together would soon fray, then snap, ushering in an era of unimaginable chaos. Around 1200 BCE, the lights went out, not gradually, but with terrifying suddenness. Within a span of mere decades, a civilization that had thrived for centuries simply vanished. Cities like Hattusa, the Hittite capital, were abandoned and burned. Ugarit, a thriving port city on the Syrian coast, was utterly destroyed. Mycenaean palaces in Greece collapsed, their intricate bureaucratic systems, and their very writing, Linear B, simply ceased to exist. Trade vanished. Populations plummeted. It was as if an entire world had hit a reset button, plunging into a dark age that would last for centuries. The records, where they existed, spoke of chaos. Pharaoh Merneptah of Egypt recounted desperate battles against unknown invaders. What force or combination of forces could bring such a mighty, interconnected world to its knees? Historians and archaeologists have grappled with this great silence for over a century, offering several compelling, yet incomplete, theories. The most dramatic, and perhaps most famous theory, centers on the mysterious Sea Peoples. Egyptian inscriptions from the reigns of Merneptah and Ramesses III speak of relentless waves of invaders, a coalition from the islands, who wreaked havoc across the Levant and threatened Egypt itself. These formidable raiders, arriving by sea, are often credited with the destruction of coastal cities like Ugarit and other sites in Canaan. Their identity remains largely unknown, debated among scholars. Were they dispossessed migrants, desperate refugees, or organized pirates? Perhaps a combination of all three. Their attacks, certainly devastating where they occurred, could explain the sudden end of maritime trade and the destruction of port cities. Yet, this theory faces significant challenges. The Sea Peoples primarily attacked coastal areas. They don't adequately explain the collapse of inland empires like the Hittites, or the widespread abandonment of sites far from the sea. They were a symptom, perhaps, but were they the ultimate disease? Another powerful explanation points to a devastating environmental shift: widespread, prolonged drought. Paleoclimate data, derived from sources like tree rings, lake sediments, and marine cores, indicates a severe and sustained drought across the eastern Mediterranean around 1200 BCE. Imagine years, even decades, of failed harvests. Crops wither, livestock perish, and the very foundations of agrarian societies crumble. Empires dependent on agricultural surplus would face widespread famine, internal unrest, and mass migrations of desperate populations. Such a catastrophe would have crippled economies, starved armies, and destabilized governments already stretched thin. While drought is undeniably a powerful stressor, critics argue it might not fully explain the speed and completeness of the collapse across such a vast and varied region. Some areas might have been more resilient, yet they too fell silent. Perhaps something else was at play, weakening the system from within. The late Bronze Age world was incredibly complex, and that complexity might have been its greatest vulnerability. This theory suggests a systemic collapse, where multiple internal pressures, exacerbated by external shocks, led to a domino effect. Think of an over-specialized system. If the copper supply from Cyprus failed due to drought or rebellion, what happened to the bronze-making industries elsewhere? If the tin route from Afghanistan was disrupted, sword production would halt. This over-reliance, combined with growing social stratification, heavy taxation for monumental projects, and potential slave revolts, could have festered beneath the surface. When the Sea Peoples arrived, or when the drought hit, these external shocks could have simply pushed already fragile internal systems past their breaking point. Starving populations, disillusioned subjects, and disgruntled mercenaries might have seized the opportunity to rise up, turning external threats into internal implosion. It wasn't one single cause, but a perfect storm of interconnected disasters. The Bronze Age collapse wasn't the end of civilization, but a painful rebirth. From the ashes of these fallen empires, new societies eventually emerged: the Iron Age, Phoenician traders, the early Greeks, and the nascent Israelite kingdoms. Lessons were learned, often the hard way. The story of the Bronze Age collapse resonates deeply in our own hyper-connected world. It serves as a stark reminder of the fragility of complex systems, the profound impact of climate change, and the critical importance of social cohesion in the face of crisis. It's a testament to both human ingenuity and our enduring vulnerability. The Bronze Age collapse remains one of history's greatest unsolved mysteries. We've explored the leading theories, but the exact truth continues to elude us. What do you think caused this great silence? Was it invaders, climate, internal strife, or a fatal combination? Share your theories in the comments below. If you found this History Distilled fascinating, give this video a like and subscribe for more deep dives into the unsettling truths and hidden corners of our past. Thank you for watching.
Look at the news today: Gaza, the West Bank, a conflict that seems endless, impossibly complex, a constant headline. But what if I told you the true roots of this struggle don't lie in the 21st century or even the 20th, But over 100 years ago, in the muddy, bloody battlefields of World War I, the decisions made in distant European capitals far from the trenches still reverberate in the deserts of the Middle East. This isn't just history, it's the blueprint for today's headlines. We're going to uncover how the collapse of a centuries-old empire and the subsequent, often betraying actions of global powers directly laid the groundwork for the Israeli-Palestinian conflict and the entire modern Middle East. This isn't about blame, but about finally understanding the intricate causal links that continue to define our present. Before the Great War exploded, the Middle East had largely been under the dominion of the Ottoman Empire, but by 1914, it was no longer the mighty power that once threatened Vienna. For centuries, it had been the sick man of Europe, bleeding territory like Hungary, Greece, Romania and Serbia. Economically, European powers had bypassed its controlled land routes, starving it of revenue, piling up massive debt. Internally, reform efforts and even revolutions, like the Young Turk Revolution in 1908, only served to further destabilize it. The stage was set, a massive power vacuum, beckoning European interference, and crucially, an environment ripe for new nationalisms to emerge. And what a diverse empire it was, a complex tapestry of ethnicities and religions. Predominantly Sunni Muslim, yes, but with substantial populations of Eastern Christians, Armenians, Greek Orthodox and significant Jewish communities. The 1914 census, though imperfect, clearly shows this vibrant mosaic across cities like Diyarbakir, Erzurum and Jerusalem. This was a rich, populated and diverse landscape that, tragically, would be largely ignored by the mapmakers in Europe. Within this weakening empire, two powerful competing nationalist movements gained momentum. First, Arab nationalism. This secular ideology emerged in the early 20th century, a direct reaction to the Ottoman Empire's centralizing Turkification policies. Educated Arabs in cities like Damascus and Beirut wanted to revive the glory of the Arab nation, to shake off Ottoman rule, emphasizing their shared language and history. The causal link is clear. Ottoman decline and oppressive policies directly ignited this desire for Arab self-determination. At the very same time, Zionism, an ethno-cultural nationalist movement, was gaining traction in late 19th century Europe, driven by virulent anti-Semitism, epitomized by events like the Dreyfus Affair. Figures like Theodor Herzl championed the idea of establishing a Jewish homeland in Palestine. This spurred waves of Jewish immigration, often with the aim of creating exclusively European Jewish agricultural communities, sometimes leading to the purchase of private lands and the exclusion of Arab labor. And here's the critical point. These two burgeoning nationalisms, Arab and Zionist, were both seeking self-determination and a homeland, crucially, on the very same geographical territory, Palestine. This wasn't merely two movements existing in parallel, it was two powerful forces with fundamentally conflicting territorial claims. Even without external intervention, this shared claim created an almost inevitable source of future conflict. World War I didn't create this inherent tension, but it provided the geopolitical context and external actors that would dramatically exacerbate it. And European powers, especially Britain, were not passive observers. They actively engaged with, arguably, manipulated these sentiments for their own strategic gains against the weakening Ottomans. Arab nationalism received significant intellectual and military support from the British Empire, while Zionism found a powerful patron in Britain, culminating in the infamous Balfour Declaration. This instrumentalization of local aspirations for imperial benefit directly contributed to the subsequent entanglements and betrayals, sowing seeds of conflict that would stretch far beyond mere local disputes. World War I dramatically accelerated the Ottoman Empire's demise. Its alliance with Germany and Austria-Hungary put it squarely against the Allied powers. For Britain, the stakes were incredibly high, securing the Dardanelles Strait for access to Russia, and more importantly, protecting the Suez Canal, its vital link to a vast overseas empire and its Persian oil supply. In pursuit of these objectives, Britain embarked on a series of diplomatic maneuvers that would later prove to be deeply contradictory and devastating. First, the Hussein McMahon Correspondence, 1915 to 1916. This was a series of 10 letters exchanged between Sharif Hussein of Mecca, a prominent Arab leader, and Sir Henry McMahon, the British High Commissioner in Egypt. In exchange for Arab support against the Ottomans, essentially a massive Arab revolt, Britain promised to support an independent Arab state in the Arab provinces of the Ottoman Empire. But here's the catch. The language regarding specific borders, especially concerning Palestine, was deliberately ambiguous. This allowed Britain to later claim Palestine was excluded from the promise. Just as the ink was drying on those promises, Britain was secretly drawing up another agreement, the Sykes-Picot Agreement of 1916. Britain carved out areas like modern-day Jordan and southern Iraq, while France claimed northern Iraq, Syria, and Lebanon. Palestine was designated for international administration. This agreement explicitly ignored the aspirations of both the local Arab and Jewish populations. They drew artificial borders on maps in European capitals, based purely on colonial interests. And then, in 1917, came the Balfour Declaration. This was a public pledge by British Foreign Secretary Arthur Balfour stating that His Majesty's government envisages favorably the establishment in Palestine of a national home for the Jewish people. The vague term national home rather than state was a deliberate diplomatic maneuver. Yet, privately, key British figures intended it to mean an eventual Jewish state. The simultaneous and contradictory nature of these three agreements reveals a British approach of making simultaneous, often contradictory pledges. This opportunistic, short-sighted diplomacy, while effective for winning the war, created an inherently unstable and conflict-prone foundation for the post-war Middle East. The dramatic revelation of the secret Sykes-Picot Agreement in November 1917 following the Russian Revolution caused immense embarrassment for Britain and France. Following World War I, the League of Nations established a mandate system, which in practice was little more than a thinly veiled form of colonialism. Britain was granted the mandate for Palestine with a task that was, by its very nature, contradictory. Prepare the territory for independence while simultaneously implementing the Balfour Declaration. In 1921, Britain further divided its mandate, creating the Emirate of Transjordan east of the Jordan River, and the Palestine Mandate to the west. This British commitment to both a Jewish national home and respecting non-Jewish rights proved to be an impossible balancing act. This created a zero-sum game where any action favoring one side was perceived as a betrayal by the other, leading to an escalating cycle of violence rather than stability. The Mandate period saw successive waves of Jewish immigration, the Aliyah. This demographic shift was accompanied by significant land purchases by Jewish organizations. The timeline of this period is a tragic escalation. 1920, Jerusalem riots break out. 1921, Jaffa riots, fueling perceptions of British favoritism. 1928-29, clashes over the Wailing Wall escalate into widespread communal violence, including the horrific Hebron massacre. 1936-39, the major Arab revolt erupts, a widespread uprising against British rule and increasing Jewish influence. Attacks on British installations and Jewish settlements. Britain suppressed this revolt with significant force, deploying troops and utilizing Jewish auxiliaries. They killed, imprisoned, or exiled Arab leaders. This approach inadvertently strengthened the military capabilities and organizational structures of Zionist militias, as Britain armed and trained some of these groups. Following the Arab revolt, Britain tried a new approach. The 1939 White Paper limited future Jewish immigration and land purchases, intended to appease Palestinian Arabs. But for Zionists, this was a profound betrayal, especially with the looming horrors of the Holocaust in Europe dramatically increasing the urgency for a Jewish homeland. This intensified Jewish insurgency, with Zionist militias targeting British infrastructure and immigration control. The infamous kidnapping and hanging of 2 British sergeants in 1947 even led to anti-Jewish rioting in Britain itself. By 1947, the British Mandate had become too costly, complicated, and bloody for an economically exhausted Britain. Recognizing the intractability, Britain finally decided to hand the problem over to the newly formed United Nations. Britain's decision marked the end of a tumultuous era of direct imperial control. In November 1947, the UN proposed a partition plan, dividing Palestine into separate Arab and Jewish states, with Jerusalem as an internationally administered zone. Zionist leaders accepted. Arab leaders largely rejected it, viewing it as an infringement on their right to self-determination. Immediately following Britain's withdrawal and Israel's declaration of independence in May 1948, the First Arab-Israeli War erupted. The Arab League intervened, and the conflict resulted in significant territorial changes, with Israel expanding beyond the UN-proposed borders. For Palestinians, this period is known as the Nakba, the catastrophe, as it led to the forced expulsion or flight of over 750,000 Palestinians from their homeland. The consequences of World War I and the British Mandate were not a one-time event that concluded in 1948. Instead, they initiated a self-perpetuating cycle of conflict. The artificial borders drawn by Sykes-Picot, the unresolved issue of Palestinian self-determination, and the deep-seated mistrust towards Western powers, a direct legacy of those contradictory wartime promises, continued to fuel regional rivalries, territorial disputes, and the ongoing Israeli-Palestinian conflict. This is a continuous feedback loop where past actions directly inform and exacerbate present tensions, making it an unfolding legacy rather than a concluded historical chapter. Britain's withdrawal, while removing the external arbiter, did not resolve the issues it created. It simply left the deeply entrenched, conflicting nationalisms, Arab and Zionist, to confront each other directly. World War I and the subsequent Mandate transformed a region under Ottoman rule into a geopolitical tinderbox, and the British exit ignited it, shifting the primary responsibility for the conflict to the local actors, albeit within a framework fundamentally designed by the former imperial powers. Understanding these roots is not about finding simple answers, but about appreciating the profound, century-long ripple effects of decisions made in a world war. It's about recognizing that some shadows truly do stretch for 100 years. If this deep dive helped you understand more about the Middle East, please give this video a like and consider subscribing to History Distilled for more untold stories that shape our world.